Just before we get started, I do want to say that this video, it's brought to you by Audible. Many of you probably already have Audible and you already listen to audiobooks just like I do, but if you don't, you should. More from Audible later in this video, including a book recommendation from me, but for now, start a free trial with Audible and get your first audiobook for free by going to audible.com/brainfood, or for our friends in the United States, you can just text brainfood, one word, to 500 500. There are generally three things that everyone knows about Garfield. It's all about a cat that hates Mondays, loves lasagna, and it's not really that funny. While the latter point, it might seem subjective, according to Garfield creator Jim Davis, the point of Garfield was never for the comic to be hilariously funny, but rather be relatable, and with that accomplished, serve as a vehicle to sell loads of Garfield merchandise. As Davis himself stated in a 1982 interview with the Washington Post, Garfield was nothing more than a conscious effort to come up with a good, marketable character. As to why he chose an animal, well, to quote him again, Snoopy is very popular in licensing. Charlie Brown is not. The genesis of Garfield can be traced all the way back to a failed comic strip Davis created in the early 1970s called Norm Nat, which centered around the various misadventures of a bunch of anthropomorphic insects. By 1977, Davis was getting nowhere with this comic. He simply couldn't understand why nobody else found gnats as funny as him. And yep, unlike Garfield, Norm Nat was supposed to be very funny. For almost 5 years, he had been printing the gag-a-day comic in a small Indianatown newspaper called the Pendleton Times. The comic, as noted, featured a bunch of sarcastic bugs, like the title character Norm Nat, a fruit fly with 2 weeks to live, a dumb, dense slug, and an intellectual worm named Dr. Rosenworm. Looking for a bigger audience and a larger payday, Davis continually attempted to get the comic syndicated in newspapers across the country, but rejection after rejection kept coming back to him. "I got so many rejection slips I could have papered my bedroom wall with them," Davis told the Los Angeles Times in 2001. Finally, an editor who rejected the comic gave him some frank criticism. "Your art is good, your gags are great, but bugs. Nobody can relate to bugs." And that was the end of Norm Nat. He was unceremoniously disposed of by a foot, and he ceased making the comic. Now it was time for Davis to come up with a new comic strip, one that he hoped would be universally relatable. Described as someone with the soul of an ad man who cut his teeth in an advertising agency before trying his hand at comics, Davis studied the popular syndicated comics of the day to see if he could spot a common thread between them. During his research, he noticed that comic strips about or starring dogs like Peanuts and Marmaduke were especially popular. This, of course, made sense because dogs have literally been bred for centuries to be what humans consider awesome. At the same time, Davis noticed that nobody had created a popular comic about a cat, which he saw as being a huge gap in the market. After all, a not inconsiderable percentage of the population prefers cats to dogs, or indeed loves both of them. He stated, "I felt that if dog lovers like dog strips, surely cat lovers would like to see a cat out there." Davis also grew up on a farm in Indiana with a couple of dozen cats, so he was familiar with their distinctive behaviors, both domesticated ones and feral, such as their stereotypical laziness. He also used elements of himself and his grandfather as inspiration for the character. Much like his grandfather, Garfield was large and he was grumpy. Like himself, the cat loved lasagna, and in homage to his grandfather, James Garfield Davis, he named the cat after him. Yep, contrary to popular belief, Garfield was not named after the US President, James Garfield. With his personality and character set, Davis came up with, as Chris Sullentrop from Slate so eloquently put it, a stable of recurring repetitive jokes for the cat that he could recycle endlessly, allowing him to churn out Garfield comics with as little effort as possible, which is amazingly fitting if you really think about it. It's at this point that we should also point out another advantage to having an animal as the main character. This is that animals could get away with more jokes and not worry about being politically correct. By virtue of being a cat, Garfield's not black, white, male or female, young or old, or a particular nationality, Davis told the Washington Post in 1981. He's not going to step on anyone's feet if these thoughts are coming from an animal. That said, Davis also very deliberately avoided political or social commentary in Garfield strips, both to ensure they were as inoffensive as possible and also so that it would appeal to the broadest audience, both in the present and over the course of time. He sagely noted in a Mental Floss interview concerning this, "I purposefully avoided socio-political comment. 30 years from now, people wouldn't understand it. It's more important to have a body of work resonate with the reader than it is to have an individual gag resonate." Davis also went out of his way to make sure the cat's appeal crossed borders, as he said in a 1982 interview. "Garfield is an international character, therefore I don't even use seasons. The only holiday I recognize is Christmas. I don't use rhyming gags, plays on words, colloquialisms, in an effort to make Garfield apply to virtually any society where he may appear. I would like for readers in Sydney, Australia to think that Garfield lives next door." Dealing with eating and sleeping, being a cat, Garfield is very universal. By virtue of being a cat, really, he's not really male or female or any particular race or nationality, young or old. Alrighty, so let's get back to the marketing side of things. Davis once again drew inspiration from Peanuts, noting in an anniversary compendium of Garfield strips that he saw the commercialization of Snoopy in particular as, to quote, "a template that I could apply to Garfield." And this wasn't just for the animal appeal, but also because, as he told the Chicago Sun-Times, after 50 years, Snoopy was still laying in that doghouse, and rather than getting old, it actually has the opposite effect. In other words, the Snoopy template allowed for continuing the same old gags over and over and over again, with people still loving it and buying merchandise, eventually, if nothing else but for nostalgia's sake. Well, the scheme, it totally worked. In June of 1978, Garfield found its way into some 40 newspapers. Less than 2 years later, it could be found across the world in over 800. By late 1982, 4.5 years after the debut, it was in a whopping 1,400 newspapers. Fast forward a few decades, and even in 2013, with the downfall of many newspapers worldwide, Garfield still showed up in over 2,500 newspapers and journals. In fact, Garfield currently holds a Guinness World Record for being the most widely syndicated comic strip in history. Using the platform of the most read comic in the world, Davis was able to easily execute stage 2 of his, quite frankly, genius plan. And this was, of course, the merchandising. Unlike the creator of Calvin and Hobbes, Bill Watterson, who famously not only passed up on but fought vehemently against merchandising Calvin and Hobbes beyond the comic material itself, and note this includes the ubiquitous and completely unauthorized Calvin peeing stickers, which Watterson joked, stating, "Long after the strip is forgotten, those decals are my ticket to immortality." However, Davis, he has no qualms about leveraging his ingenious creation to squeeze every dime possible out of it. That said, in all merchandising and licensing opportunities, he does strongly consider how something might harm the brand, whether because of poor association or simply oversaturation to the point of people getting sick of Garfield. For example, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, Garfield's suction cup plush toys became so hugely successful they almost achieved fad status. He stated of this crisis, "We accepted the royalty checks, but my biggest fear was overexposure. Being in it for the long term," he stated of this, "we pulled all plush dolls off the shelves for 5 years. But the plush dolls weren't the only place money was pouring in from. In fact, even in the early days of the comic's popularity, Davis admitted to only spending a little over a dozen hours a week working on the comic itself, with another 60 or so hours spent coming up with and managing merchandising and licensing deals, as well as ideas. This includes everything from your standard books, which, by the way, at one point saw Garfield with 7 such books on the New York Times bestsellers list at the same time. Oh, and that's not even mentioning the slot machines in Las Vegas, the toilet seat covers, a Garfield restaurant, and even educational material, with Garfield licensed in some regions for use in textbooks which would teach children English. So at this point, you might be wondering, well, how much money has Davis made from this? Not only is the comic enormously successful, but the merchandising is an absolute behemoth. Well, Well, nobody knows for sure but Davis and presumably the IRS. That said, it is known that sales of Garfield merchandise gross in the ballpark of $1 billion, yes, with a B, every single year worldwide, even today. So, we guess you kind of have to hand it to Davis. Not only did he achieve his goal of creating an enjoyable comic for the masses, but he also masterfully ran the business side of things, making him probably the most successful comic creator in history on both fronts, and there's certainly no end in sight. Yep, unlike other comic book artists who packed it in when they had enough money or hit a creative roadblock, Davis stated that he has no such intention of doing this. However, to save time and the risk of burnout, he's long since stopped drawing the cartoons himself, usually leaving that to employees of his rather large company. As for running out of ideas, well, the comic was designed to be repetitive, so that kind of negates that problem. He further notes, "I've never worried that I would run out of material because I've never written the material. I just watch Garfield, I put him in my head like a TV screen and watch him. I ask what he would do, what he would say. It's almost like a working meditation. I just edit the material." That said, in more recent times, Davis has also leveraged a subset of his many dozens of employees to generate rough ideas for future comics. Of this process, he notes, "I see gags, and I work with assistants on the strip and stuff like that. We do roughs, and it all filters through me, so that it has one voice. We all get together occasionally in the same room and draw and work on shapes of figures and gestures and expressions and things like that, so that if any one of us draws it, you can't tell which one did it." In the end, Davis summed up his rather impressive life's work, both in the entertaining comic he created and the amazing business acumen demonstrated in its creation and growth over time, as I think part of the appeal is, like with Peanuts, you always want to go back and see Snoopy on the doghouse. In such a changing world, readers want to know that some things stay the same. So I feel a responsibility to keep Garfield loving lasagna and hating Mondays. He's never going to go on a diet. And by the way, unlike his famous character, Davis has on several occasions noted that he himself loves Mondays. And maybe, like Davis, you'd like to love Mondays too, and nothing makes that easier than a cup of coffee and an audiobook to start the week with some inspiration. Personally, I've listened to dozens of audiobook autobiographies from business titans through the ages, and if you liked the story from today's video, I think you'll dig a lot of those as well. Previously, I've mentioned Arnold Schwarzenegger's Total Recall, his autobiography. It's an amazing listen, but there are lots and lots of other ones out there. Audiobooks, they're just amazing, and if you're not listening to them, you should be already. Alright, so I hope I've sold you on audiobooks. They're great, but why Audible? Well, that's simply because it's the best way to do it. Membership gives you one free book a month, no matter the length, a huge range of titles, amazing apps. You've got Speed Listen, which I use a lot, and you also own the books. It's not a rental service. If you cancel later, you still have those books forever, so you can go back and listen to them at any time you want. Oh, and by the way, if you get a book and you don't like it, just trade it back in and get another one. That is free. And you know what else is free? Their trial, which includes a free audiobook. You can get that by going to audible.com/brainfood or texting brainfood, one word, to 500 500 if you are in the US. And now for some bonus facts. Speaking of the Garfield suction cup dolls that have made millions of dollars over the years for Davis, it turns out these were sort of an accident. He stated, "I designed the first stuck-on-you doll with Velcro on the paws, thinking that people would stick it on curtains. It came back as a mistake with suction cups. They didn't understand the directions, so I stuck it on a window and said, if he's still there in 2 days, we'll approve this." Well, they were good suction cups, and we released it like that. It never occurred to me that people would put them on cars. Now for another bonus fact. Not just being initially inspired by Charles Schulz's Snoopy, Davis also noted Schulz gave him an invaluable piece of advice at one point. According to Davis in a Mental Floss interview, Schulz was instrumental in getting Garfield to stand up and walk on 2 feet for the first time. "I was working on Garfield's first special at Bill Melendez's studio in LA, and Sparky, Schulz, was in the next room working on one of his specials. I wanted Garfield to get up and dance through the opening credits, and he looked terrible standing up. He just didn't look natural. Sparky asked me how it was going, and I said, not so well. I was doing the layout drawings, and I said, look at him, Garfield. He looks awkward. He said, that's because you gave him these little cat feet. He told me what he did with Snoopy's. Snoopy used to walk on little dog feet, and when I stood him up, I made his hind feet really big like human feet, and it looked natural. He said, here, do this. And he took my pencil and drew over the top of my drawing with these big feet like he has today. He said, so there. Now he's standing. I go, that's it. I was blown away. Here was Charles Schulz's drawing on my drawing. When Garfield got the big back feet, then he could walk. And now for another bonus fact. Not just about the money for himself, Davis is also noted for being great on collaborations and apparently a really cool guy. For example, we have the case of the webcomic Garfield minus Garfield, where Davis stated, "It was kind of funny, we called Dan and the second we identified ourselves he said, 'I'm so sorry, you want me to cease and desist, right?' We said, 'No, we want to collaborate on a book with you.'" So I really hope you found that video interesting, and if you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below and don't forget to subscribe. Also, Audible, that's at audible.com/brainfood for your free book. And as always, thank you for watching.